Welcome to Embracing the Difference Globally, the Ability event. Session 4 will begin shortly. I'd like to just take a moment to thank our partners this year. Rehabilitation Counseling Program from St. Cloud State University, St. Cloud State University Special Education Department, Hamlin University, Metropolitan State University, and Normandale Community College.
Okay, I think we're ready to officially start then at the top of the noon hour. And I'll be keeping an eye as moderator of the session. So my name is Kathryn Johnson, and I wanted to just welcome everyone who is here. And Gerard, you already have somebody from UNESCO. Catherine Carty is saying hello to you in the question and answer. So for inclusive sport in Ireland. So very nice to have her join us too. Thank you for welcoming colleagues both at St. Cloud State University and within the United States. And then we have our global participants from all around. So today our session will focus on Gerard and his work as the UN Special Rapporteur for persons with disabilities. This is an excellent timing for this presentation. We've all attained baseline knowledge and understanding of the CRPD, both from the perspective of the International Disability Alliance. So we had some touch on the international work, and then the National Council on Disability with Andre, and really looking at what's happening in the United States and what can we be doing in leadership roles and capacity building, and as advocates for the CRPD. And so today we're looking forward to your presentation. I will take a step back though and say, again, my name is Kathryn, and I am a professor at St. Cloud State. I am a middle-aged, we'll say, right, Don? Middle-aged faculty member. I have on a beige jacket and red hair and green glasses, and I'm standing where you can see outside the trees at St. Cloud State University in Minnesota, where we are experiencing fall right now. So it's quite beautiful outside. All right. Then Gerard, just for logistics, as you are doing your presentation for the first part of it, I will turn off my camera. I'll be here if you need me. I'm not going to go anywhere, but that helps then get our interpreters more balanced for you. Okay. All right. I would like to introduce Mr. Gerard Quinn. Please introduce yourself.
Thank you very much, Kathy. My name is Gerard Quinn. I'm the UN Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. I live on the west coast of Ireland, which is by far the most beautiful part of Europe. I was asked to give some audio descriptions of myself. Again, I'm a middle-aged guy wearing a blue shirt and a purple tie. Behind me, there's a lot of books on literature. Don't be fooled, they're my wife's books. I'm not a literary person at all. She's the literary one in the family. It's a very, very beautiful evening here in the west coast of Ireland, and I'm really delighted to be with you. When I came on board in the UN system, I said one of the things I want to do around the world is support disability studies programs to help people initiate disability studies programs. And we're doing a lot of work in every corner of the world on that at the moment.
Excellent.
I think what I might do is give you some personal background and why I was involved in the movement, and then talk to you more specifically about the role or the three main tasks of a UN Special Rapporteur. First of all, just a little bit of background. I was a graduate student in your country in the 1980s, and we came back to Ireland. We started in one of the universities here, and then we had our first daughter who was born with a disability in 1989. And I remember as if it were yesterday, watching President Bush #1 sign into law the Americans with Disabilities Act. And then the penny dropped, and not just with me, with many, many, many hundreds of thousands of people around the world, that we could do something similar in Europe, in Africa, in the whole world. And you should take some pride that it was the Americans with Disabilities Act that really, really kickstarted the movement worldwide for justice and human rights for persons with disabilities. even before the ADA was adopted, people don't realize this, Sweden and Italy proposed draft treaties to the UN on the rights of persons with disabilities. That was actually in 1988. They look very quaint now when you read them, but it was a very bona fide effort to try and shift gears internationally on the rights of persons with disabilities. So the 1990s were very interesting. Obviously, a lot was happening in your country. A lot of countries around the world were taking note of what was happening in your country on disability issues, particularly the European Union, but also other countries around the world. At the time, the United Nations was very soft on disability issues. Sweden and Italy had their proposal rejected in the late 1980s, but the consolation prize, if I can put it that way, was a soft, non-binding instrument on disability called, and it's a bit of a mouthful, the UN Standard Rules on Equalization of Opportunities for Persons with Disabilities. If you just Google UN Standard Rules, you will get them. Excellent instrument, but absolutely no critical bite, no legal standing whatsoever, and they weren't really instrumental in driving change or in kickstarting change in countries that did not have a history of change on disability rights. So the argument throughout the 90s was, why not shift a gear again and draft a thematic treaty on the rights of persons with disabilities? At that point in time, you may be interested to know, only one side of the House was engaged on disability issues, and that was the UN Commission for Social Development. So symbolically, disability was seen as a soft social welfare issue. If you wanted to be pejorative about it, you would say it was seen as a charity issue in the UN system. There was a UN Human Rights Commission, which subsequently became a UN Human Rights Council, but traditionally they did not take an interest in disability issues. It was shunted off to the Commission for Social Development. That changed in the 90s, partly because the ADA began to embolden people to move to a justice and rights framing of disability. Thank you, USA, for that. Partly also because the new High Commissioner for Human Rights was Mary Robinson from my country, who took a very passionate interest in disability. So every 2 years then, a resolution on human rights and disability went to the UN Human Rights Commission. Hand on heart, these resolutions were really as boring as they come. You really had to keep toothpicks to hold your eyes open because there was no real critical bite in them. Toward the late 1990s, a bunch of us were asked around the world, what could they do to put some life into those periodic resolutions? So a few of us, independently of each other, said it's time you put into the resolution that the UN would start seriously considering drafting a treaty, a legally binding treaty on the rights of persons with disabilities. Funnily enough, that resolution was torpedoed by 2 or 3 EU member states. I won't mention them here, but the Office of the High Commission, Mary Robinson, and a few others decided to go again to produce a study to show that the existing system was not working for persons with disabilities, and then maybe to build the argument for why we should start drafting a treaty. Lo and behold, something completely unexpected happened. Mexico, for its own internal political reasons, pushed the agenda forward in the UN General Assembly in New York, not in the UN Human Rights Council in Geneva. Everybody expected a treaty, if it would be drafted under the aegis of the Human Rights Council in Geneva, but that was not to be the case. It actually started in New York. And the UN system tentatively, very tentatively, set in motion what's called an ad hoc committee of states to begin looking at drafting a treaty. There was no guarantee that a treaty would be drafted, and ad hoc meant ad hoc. Any state that wanted to turn up could turn up, and others, if they wanted, could be present in the room as well. So really a series of historical accidents, all very beautiful historical accidents, led to the drafting of the treaty. I was one of those who produced the study for the Office of the High Commission, and then I led one of the delegations in the drafting of the Convention for Rehabilitation International. So we have a treaty. It's concluded in 2006. It was almost a record period within which to produce a treaty. And I'm sure you know by now, it is near universal ratification throughout the world. There are only 3 or 4 countries that haven't ratified. Unfortunately, your country is one of those who has not ratified. Up to that point, I think I mentioned that the Commission for Social Development took charge of disability issues. There was a special rapporteur on disability, but he was answerable to the Commission for Social Development. He was not answerable to the Human Rights Council. So when the treaty was adopted, people started thinking, we shouldn't lose this role, but maybe we should repurpose it to be directly answerable to the Human Rights Council, and of course, to also make appearances before the Commission for Social Development. So think about it, that's a very symbolic move, that you're moving the role of Special Rapporteur from soft social policy, and I don't mean that in a pejorative sense, to much harder law, human rights, and justice framing based in Geneva. And that happened about 7 or 8 years ago. And as usually is the case, a number of states got together to propose a resolution to create a new Office of Special Rapporteur, answerable directly to the Human Rights Council. And the 3 countries that put that forward were Mexico, Finland, and New Zealand. They are what's called the core of the Friends of the Mandate of the Special Rapporteur. So the Special Rapporteur was set up about 6-7 years ago. And basically there's 3 main tasks. There's a lot more, but I think it's instructive just to focus on 3 main tasks. First is what I like to call shining a light. So you produce thematic studies, thematic reports, 2 a year, and they're supposed to trigger high-level conversations at the very highest level in the UN system on disability rights, disability justice, disability issues. Nobody dictates to a special rapporteur what these thematic studies should be. Not the Office of the High Commission, not the member states, but of course, if the member states like what your menu is as a candidate for the post, then as it were, you feel as if you have a mandate to proceed. And what I suggested to the member states in the interview process a year ago was, number 1, we have to be elevating the disability issue from a silo and connecting it with grand challenges facing humankind. For example, armed conflicts and disability. For example, artificial intelligence and disability, and how it's going to change the rules of the game. So much so that the furthest left behind might never have a chance to catch up unless we get artificial intelligence right. Excuse me. And also climate change and disability, and the necessity for building a much more inclusive and resilient society and economy into the future. So that's the first big tranche of thematic reports that we're going to be producing. We also suggested that we need to be more engaged on intersectional issues. And I've noticed that your administration for community living in the United States focuses both on community living for people with disabilities and older persons as well. Personally, I find it a bit ridiculous that we focus so much on deinstitutionalization for people with disabilities. And I'm really looking at us in Europe now when I make this comment. And then we focus so much on institutionalizing older people. Makes no sense. Makes a lot more sense for us to develop more sustainable policy solutions intersectionally across the traditional divisions between, let's say, disability and old age. And that's just an example. So, for example, one of the reports we want to produce, thematic report, will be on Indigenous persons with disabilities worldwide, which is not only a big issue in the usual places like Australia, New Zealand, United States, Canada, but also in the Nordic countries who have a substantial Sami Indigenous population. And then we said we'd like to focus on neglected rights or neglected issues, one of which being the right of access to culture, because think about it for a moment, it's through culture that we create shared meanings, shared understandings, and maybe a shared pathway to a completely different future. One of the things that particularly interests me is the role of regional organizations, such as the Organization of American States, the African Union, the European Union, ASEAN, etc., etc. So to make a very long story short, over a 6-year period, we're planning a series of thematic reports on armed conflicts, and most of those will go to the UN General Assembly for debate. We're planning a series of thematic reports on topical issues like artificial intelligence, Indigenous persons with disabilities, and the right to culture, and they will go to the UN Human Rights Council. Maybe I should have explained every year, at the beginning of the year, we appear before the Human Rights Council, and then at the end of the year, we appear before the UN General Assembly. In fact, I'm appearing before the General Assembly tomorrow to explain our very first thematic report, which is on armed conflicts and disability. So that's the first main task, thematic reporting. And it's not an end in and of itself. It's supposed to trigger an interactive dialogue, a very important conversation at the very highest level in the UN system. So we're looking forward to the debate tomorrow amongst member states in the UN system. Last time around, we had about 80 states participate in the interactive dialogue, which is a very, very positive sign for the mandate and for the future. Last time around, the topic was very much COVID-19 and its impact on persons with disabilities. and it was quite a fascinating debate. So that's the first main task, thematic reporting. The agenda is stretched out over 6 years. Not all of this will get done at once, but that gives you a flavor of how we intend to proceed. The second main task is country visits. Now, you may have been told by previous speakers that the UN treaty bodies, the UN Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, in some exceptional circumstances, can conduct an in-country visit. But that's very exceptional. Usually, for example, if there's a suspected pattern of egregious violations of the treaty. And it's not very well done by most treaty bodies. But special rapporteurs are expected to do 2 in-depth country visits per year. Now, an interesting feature about this is to do a country visit, your country does not necessarily have to ratify the UN CRPD. So theoretically, if I made the request and the State Department agreed, because the State Department would have to agree, I could do a country visit to the United States, which would be for 2 weeks, looking in depth at the record of the United States on the rights of persons with disabilities. I'm just using that as an example. Obviously, COVID has interrupted our plans quite a bit. My personal priority is to try and visit some post-conflict countries or countries that are in transition, where they're trying to rebuild and mend some of the fractured problems in their countries. For the moment, that's not possible. By the way, there are 16 hot wars taking place around the world today, which is incredible when you think about it. So we are probably going to postpone that for 2 or 3 years. What we're looking to do is visit, for example, the European Union, not the member states, but the European Union institutions in Brussels, partly because the EU has a new disability strategy internally in the European Union, but partly also because it wants to step up in the world, contributing to advancing disability rights around the world. I'm particularly interested in visiting some Arab countries, maybe Jordan, maybe 1 or 2 others, and also some countries in the former Soviet sphere, like, for example, Georgia, who are doing some really, really interesting work, particularly on institutionalization and deinstitutionalization. So usually we report back to the Human Rights Council and the General Assembly on these country visits. A country report is put together after all the country visits. We make sure that we meet with civil society groups, human rights commissions, bodies like that, maybe the Bar Association, and not just the government and civil servants and others attached to the government, like service providers. The UN Treaty on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities routinely looks to these reports for ideas and insights and knowledge, and routinely cites to these in-country reports in putting together its questions to the states, as well as its concluding observations and recommendations to the states. So it's a fascinating process, and hopefully we're beginning in January, hopefully with the European Union. The third main task of a special rapporteur is something that's very, very euphemistically called communications. And to you or I, what that means is complaints, either individual or group complaints. Very few people realize this. When people think about complaints, what they naturally think about is the optional protocol to the UN Disability Treaty. If, and this is a big if, your country has ratified the optional protocol as well as the treaty, then exceptionally you can bring a complaint to the treaty body itself. But you do not have to have ratified the UN CRPD to actually bring a complaint before the UN Special Rapporteur. That knowledge, the knowledge about how you can do this, when you can do it, is very, very unevenly spread, which is one reason I love talking to you and your students today and many other groups like you around the world. Basically what happens is when a complaint comes in, or a communication, if you will, the Office of the High Commission corroborate the facts. So we can't just jump off and begin engaging with the government because maybe some of the facts are hearsay, maybe they're not as strongly corroborated as they might be, maybe we need more independence, verification of the facts as alleged, and so forth. If the office is satisfied that the information is sound and can be corroborated, then we have a number of options. If the issue is literally life or death, and we've had a few of those, then we can issue what's called an urgent action appeal direct to the government in point. And normally this is done behind closed doors. The intention, of course, is to create space for an amicable solution, and hopefully then the urgent issue will be resolved for dealing with another day. Unfortunately, we've had 2 or 3 of these, which involved in 1 or 2 instances the death penalty affecting persons with disabilities. So that's the first category. The second is what's called an other letter. Now, this is all jargon within the UN system. You'd be forgiven for not really understanding immediately what this means. What it means is you have a case that falls short of an urgent action measure. So it's not a life or death situation, but it could well be legislation or a policy or a financial instrument that causes us concern that it violates one or other of the articles of the UN Convention. So in those instances, we put an open letter to get an other letter together, and that recounts the facts, speaks to the legislation in point, and then makes the argument that the legislation, if we understand it right, seems to violate Article X, Y, or Z of the Convention, and then invite the state into a dialogue on the matter in point. And we've had to do that on 2 or 3 occasions, and mostly the state enters into a constructive dialogue and sometimes actually changes the legislation after the fact, although that can take some time to do. The correspondence, the dialogue between the Special Rapporteur and the state remains confidential for a period of, I think, 3 months. And again, the intention is to create a headspace for the state to reflect on its position and maybe adjust its position accordingly. The last category is where there isn't an urgent action required, like a life or death situation. There isn't legislation on the books that allegedly violates the convention, but the country in question might be about to legislate, and others feel that the draft legislation, if adopted, would violate the convention. We've had that on 1 or 2 occasions. The one that's public, because we're beyond the 3-month period, is the medically assisted right to die legislation that went through the Canadian Parliament earlier this year. And we issued a letter to the Canadian authorities requesting them to reflect more deeply on the draft legislation, because it was our view that it offended or potentially offended against 2 or 3 articles in the UN CRPD. And in actual fact, we were invited in to give testimony before the Canadian Senate on that draft legislation. I believe it was modified to some extent, but not fully. And essentially, the Canadian government decided to proceed and, as it were, take their chances with the UN CRPD committee when they next come up for review before that committee. So these are the 3 large tasks: shining a light through thematic reporting and initiating a high-level discussion, doing in-depth country visits, which no other bodies in the UN system are mandated to do, and then engaging in communications, or what you or I would call complaints, and handling them with governments, normally behind closed doors, but eventually the correspondence goes public after a set period of time. I should tell you that we don't work in isolation. There are 44 thematic special rapporteurs. The system has grown up quite ad hoc. It very much depends on which states want to advance particular issues. So some states are very focused on torture. Some states are very focused on disability. Other states could be very focused on environmental degradation and human rights and so forth. So we have 44 thematic special rapporteurs. About 7 or 8 of them focus on what I call identity-specific issues. Like me, I'm the SR on disability, but we also have a special rapporteur. She's actually called a special expert, but it doesn't make any difference to the work on the rights of older people, and we collaborate very, very closely. We also have special rapporteur on sexual orientation, gender, believe it or not, albinism, and leprosy. And we all collaborate very, very closely. And there are also 11, soon to be 12 special rapporteurs focusing on particular countries. For example, the special rapporteur on Myanmar at the moment is a former US Congressman, Tom Andrews, who does an absolutely fabulous job. And he himself has a disability and is quite fascinated with the impact of conflicts on persons with disabilities, and equally interested in the role of persons with disabilities in rebuilding their societies, in peace-building operations into the future and so forth. So we're contemplating setting up some sort of platform on intersectionality primarily between the identity-based special rapporteurs, gender, sexual orientation, disability, but also working in some of the others who shoot through. For example, there's a special rapporteur on extreme poverty, very, very able special rapporteur with a lot of insights into poverty and disability. Indeed, we may be doing some work jointly together on that. And indeed, the special rapporteur on the right to health, newly appointed from South Africa, is also extremely interested in particularly the future of mental health, which of course is something that interests me as special rapporteur on the rights of persons with disabilities. Maybe I should have mentioned that the Office of the High Commission for Human Rights in Geneva supports the special rapporteurs and their functions, does not dictate to the special rapporteur how they should operate, but provides at least one point person to support the special rapporteur. I should also mention, and I will conclude here, Kathy, and hand it back to you, that none of the special rapporteurs are remunerated for their work. It's a voluntary post. All of us are supported elsewhere, some from academic institutions, some from other institutions, but it does not come with a stipend. It's not a post you would willingly chase in order to grow rich, let's put it that way, or even stay alive. So, okay, Kathy, back to you. Hopefully that's whetted your appetite, and look forward to Q&A.
Definitely. Whoops, sorry. Okay, yes, I am here. I'll back up a little bit. So thank you so much. What a depth of knowledge and understanding of the history that really helps bring us full circle on where we came at this point in time. So a couple questions for you. Actually, tomorrow you shared that you will be presenting and sharing information about armed conflict and disabilities. Is that correct? Could you highlight some of the key points of your report that you'll be sharing tomorrow?
Yes, very happy to do so. In fact, the report is in the public domain already. It's on our website, but I'm happy to send you the link and feel free to circulate. How to say this? The convention is very unusual in that it actually has an article in it on situations of emergency and risk. And that includes not just the normal things you would expect, like floods, tornadoes, tsunamis, but also, quote unquote, man-made risks and emergencies. For example, armed conflict and other forms of humanitarian crises. So it's a very unusual provision in an international treaty. Most human rights treaties do not reference this. So it automatically interfaces with what's called international humanitarian law. To URI, what that means is the laws of war, okay? How hostilities are conducted. For example, you may not be aware that the choice of ordnance can be hugely traumatizing on persons with psychosocial disabilities, civilians with disabilities caught up in theater of action and so forth. You may not be aware that there are at least anecdotal accounts of some armed groups using people with disabilities as human shields around the world, and so on and so forth. So we've, I started on this 3 years ago, believe it or not, with NATO. We held a workshop on protecting civilians with disabilities during armed conflict. NATO is very, very interested in this. And then we decided we'd produce a thematic study and we'd open it out a bit. We wouldn't just focus on the conduct of hostilities or international humanitarian law and how it should be further nuanced to take account of the presence of persons with disabilities, but we opened it out into what we call the peace continuum. That's not our language, that's the language used by the UN Secretary General himself. What he means by that is conflict prevention processes, the conduct of conflict, evacuation and humanitarian relief, peacekeeping operations, which is usually UN mandated peacekeeping operations. And to me, coming from my own country, what's particularly significant is peace building operations, and looking there for not at the static or inert protection of civilians with disabilities, but looking at their human agency to change their societies into the future. So we laid that out, we unzipped the peace continuum, we rated how visible people with disabilities are on each point in that continuum, and lo and behold, found that they are relatively invisible throughout most of the continuum, except for humanitarian relief. There's a lot of positive action happening there throughout the world. We intend following it up with a more specific report on the conduct of hostilities, which decoded what that means as international humanitarian law and how it can be nuanced further. And then with a third report on peace building processes and disability. I'm glad to see your US Peace Institute in Washington is now beginning to start projects on peace building and people with disabilities throughout the world. So it's an opportune moment to be doing that kind of work. So that's 3 bites at the cherry, 3 thematic reports over an 18-month period.
Yep.
And we're sustaining a deep focus on the topic. The topic also emerged in the UN Security Council 2 years ago. So what we're doing is keeping it alive and making sure the conversation continues.
Excellent. And that, you know, one of the things when we had the presentation by Andre from the National Council on Disability, he talked about how within the healthcare system, there really needs to be disability, cultural competency for people going into the health field, but it's also in the humanitarian field. And it's in the recovery during, you know, the armed conflict zones where we need to have, that really hit me when he shared about that as a competency that is needed within so many professional careers. And so thank you for alluding to that. There was a question by Steve Anderson from Hamline University in Minnesota. He asked, you know, when we look at the CRPD, and you shared again that the United States has not ratified the CRPD, what are the consequences of not having the United States ratify the CRPD?
Oh, what a tremendously good question. You know, the US has done a lot and continues to do a lot, particularly through USAID and bilaterally around the world, but it can't be part of the global conversation. I should have explained that there's another very interesting organ set up by the UN CRPD, which is called the Conference of States Parties. This is where the global community comes together once a year, the states, and they discuss topical issues among themselves. The US can be informally present, but it cannot be formally part of the process, and it cannot shape the agenda. So you can only be in that process if you ratify the CRPD. And I feel that's a big loss, because on certain issues, the US is still the market leader. For example, your administration on community living, it's almost unthinkable that that would be anchored in the European Union. And I think that's crazy. We've got to have something like, we've got to mimic some of these excellent things around the world. But there's a lack of knowledge because the interface just isn't there. So I very much regret that. The convention is like the ADA second generation, because it super adds a highly developed social model on top of the civil rights model. But, you know, it's still not a million miles away from some positive social developments, at least within some of your states. So it'd be very, very, very useful to the rest of the world to have you in the multilateral conversations. And by the way, you can't vote for a member of the UN treaty body if you haven't ratified the convention. So in a sense, if you don't like the interpretations, the usual remedy is get your own guy voted in, but you can't even do that because you're not part of the process.
Yes. My apologies as an American citizen.
No,
but that is why we're doing our presentations that we are, is to increase the knowledge and understanding of the significance of the CRPD and the significance of the role of the United States in those dialogue sessions within the global community. You alluded to the fact, though, also that part of the challenge with the international development is that knowledge sharing and expertise back and forth. And I was pleased to see the report that you did on international involvement of people with disabilities. And that is something, you know, true to my heart, that the work that I do with China we really work to ensure including individuals, students or faculty or community members who have disabilities to join our delegations. And like I said, we have a visiting scholar here from China who is here doing her research that I believe will really advance Chinese Sign Language education and training in China. And so could you share more about that specific report? Because that's something near and dear to the work that Dr. Knopf and I do together.
So which report is that? Sorry.
A report on involving individuals with disabilities in international development.
Oh, yes. No, that was the report of my predecessor, Kathryn.
Okay.
Yeah. And she presented it and I presented it last year to the UN Human Rights Council and was very, very well received by a number of the aid agencies around the world. Since she wrote that, it'd be better to get her to talk about it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Then let me just check here if there are others who had questions. I know we had some individuals ask for a recording. Nick did share in the chat that the recordings will all be in the library that we do have. And so let me see some other questions. Is there anyone here in our audience at St. Cloud State that has a question at all? All right. Well, I'm just pleased to have the opportunity to get to know you and share a little bit, if you could, about the UN International Day for People with Disabilities and your role or involvement or what you're doing to celebrate that significant day.
Yep. Excuse me. Take just a little bit of water. Yep. Just before we reach that, maybe I don't know if anyone explained previously, but the US wasn't active during the drafting of the convention. The US Department of Justice and others were present, and certainly a lot of very valuable insights, but took a back seat in the negotiations. I think that was because of hesitancy about multilateral diplomatic fora in the early 2000s. The people who turned up, though, from the Justice Department and others were absolutely first rate and have followed proceedings very closely, including John Wodach, who used to work in the Civil Rights Division. To me, and I'm speaking personally here, to have the UN CRPD without the US is like Hamlet without the prince. I don't think it's sustainable. It really, we want you and we need you at the global level. The UN Day, December 3rd, is supposed to be a celebration. And usually a lot of groups come together at the UN and indeed regionally. It actually started in the European Union in the early 1990s. In fact, the European Parliament symbolically gave its grand chamber over to people with disabilities to celebrate European Day of People with Disabilities. I think the first one was 1992, 93. Again, very close in point to the Americans with Disabilities Act.
Yep.
You should be proud of that. And then it became adopted at global level, and usually it's a fantastic way of bringing very high-level political speakers to kind of recommit to the agenda at the very highest level. So, yeah, the UN Special Rapporteur is usually in attendance. With me, I'm going to have to be in the UN system, but also in the European system this time around. But that's okay. Yeah.
Well, we welcome you to come join us in Dubai. We will be celebrating in the US Pavilion that day with St. Cloud State, World Enabled, Moz Travels, Harkin Institute. A number of us have come together, and that's close to Jordan, where you said you wanted to visit, do a country visit. Yep. So we could have multiple purposes. But there is another question. This one is from Kathryn Cardy. You mentioned education at the start of your presentation. Why do you think universities recognize their role in terms of the inclusion of students with disabilities on campus, yet do not bring that into their curricula, which would help build capacity across disciplines?
Yeah, great question. And kind of getting back to your point, Kathy, originally about across-discipline learning. You know, COVID to me was very instructive because it showed how shaky the foundations were to disability rights around the world. I was very interested in your Office of Civil Rights, I think in your Department of Health and Social Services, which pushed back a lot against, I think it was Pennsylvania, that had purported to enact ethical guidelines on rationing of ventilators for people with disabilities. And the Office of Civil Rights pushed back very, very hard. And basically said that you can't make decisions, medical life or death decisions, based on judgments about the quality of life or the worthiness of life, and so on and so forth. And it turned out when you looked under the hood a bit more, it wasn't the state that were making these determinations. It was ethical bodies within the medical profession. So what that said to me was that we'd done zero education in the medical profession. We've done a lot in the legal profession, but hey, law doesn't touch everything, right? And we've done zero sensitization within the medical profession on stereotypes, on images, on unbiased, you know, the skewed nature of quality of life in displays, and we had not done the work. And that says to me that's the future. We've got to be reaching out to all of the other schools, not just medical, but engineering, architecture, you name it, to make sure that the message gets out much further. And there is a very, very interesting School of Architecture in Royal Melbourne Institute of Technology. I always have to think about that, RMIT, on disaster and design, which is really about how do you create inclusive spaces for displaced populations, including people with disabilities around the world. And I was thinking, that's an example of where they're actually taking it seriously, and that's what we have to do. Should I just one more comment on that, which is, to me, it's not about knowledge, and it's not about credentials. It's really about a mindset. And I think the most important thing for students is to give them the tools so that they can become agents of change in their own right, in whatever chosen profession they enter into. And that's the most important thing to me in terms of university-based education.
Thank you. Yes, most definitely. And in the area of international development, we can develop policies. We can fund economically, funded projects or whatever. We can provide the education, but the social, cultural values towards individuals with disabilities is one of the biggest barriers that we all need to rise above in the collaborative work that we do. There's another question here. Eugene Ho asks a question. She's an amazing superstar. You need to meet her too. Thanks for organizing this event. I have a quick question about Professor Quinn's upcoming trip to China. Maybe that's happening, we're not sure. Would it be possible to share what this trip will be for and possible chances for collaborations with national or local organizations of persons with disabilities there?
Yeah, I know China quite well. I go to Wuhan Law School, as well as Fudan in Shanghai, in Renmin in Beijing. And China's a fascinating country on disability issues. I mentioned previously that the US, although was present in the room during the drafting of the treaty, remained largely silent. The two blocs that were the most active were the European Union and China. And largely quite positively, I must say. There were one or two hiccups, but there always are in treaty negotiations. And China's fascinating for a number of reasons. They've adopted some interesting legislation in the last 2 years on inclusive education. And they're also interesting because they purport to be a developing country. So it's fascinating to see how they operationalize the UN Sustainable Development Goals alongside the UN CRPD. The point about in-country trips is not necessarily to identify one or two things that draw you to a particular country, but to simply go there with an open mind and try and figure out what are the inhibiting factors for change and what are the critical success factors for change in a country like China, and can they be replicated? You know yourself, it's an endlessly fascinating environment. My own experience is that no matter how closed a society or a political system appears to be to us, as for example, Westerners, there are always ways to bring about change. And it's always fascinating to me that people with disabilities have so much entrepreneurial skills in actually bringing about change in places we wouldn't expect it to happen. So I'm going with an open mind. By the way, it's not possible right now because there's a 2-week quarantine. Plus, in the Beijing area, the municipality has added a 3rd week. And by the way, the UN system will not pay a dime for even a day spent in quarantine. So it's impossible for the foreseeable future, but who knows, maybe toward the end of next year, it'll become possible.
Yes, I agree. I miss China greatly, but I'm thankful that I have a friend from China with me that I can be with. So that helps.
Yep.
So wonderful questions. The last one that, is impacting all of us, this is from Steve Anderson again, is just the reality of living with COVID. Like you said, we won't be able to go back to China for probably another year, but overall, what has been and continues to be the effects of COVID worldwide on persons with disabilities, the greatest challenges?
There was a fantastic report done on this, what's called the Disability Rights Monitor, maybe about 6 months ago, and it gathered together the evidence from right around the world. I put an essay together on this, but that really is the gold mine. And it shows a number of things. It shows that the various steps taken for disease prevention and inclusion were not inclusive of persons with disabilities. It shows heightened vulnerability of people with disabilities in congregated settings everywhere in the world. Sweden is a very interesting case in point, where most people who died from COVID were older people living in institutions. By the way, Denmark is exactly the opposite. Most people who died with COVID were people with pre-existing conditions living in the community. But what that showed up was the lack of resilient community services for those people with disabilities. And also there was a lot of rationing of healthcare services. By the way, the Australian Human Rights Commission has just done hugely influential work on the rationing of vaccines, which is just fascinating in a new area. So for all those reasons, that it's had a lot of negative impacts. And I would say a lot of them were shared with older people. They weren't just peculiar to people with disabilities. And I guess we're trying to flip it now more positively into, well, if you build back better in the US, or if we build back better at the international community, what's the place, what's the role of the voice of persons with disabilities in doing that? Because it was pretty obvious that in the early days of responding to COVID, there was no voice of persons with disabilities. If there was, a lot of the mistakes could have been avoided.
Right. And it's that international collaboration again, and what we learned from this. Hopefully not for that next global pandemic during our generation. Let's hope not. But
Yep.
still moving forward, dealing with COVID as we go through more and more waves along the way. But this has been a fantastic hour. I was really looking forward to this, and I learned a lot. So I hope our student participants here at St. Cloud State and our online colleagues were also able to gain a deeper understanding and hopefully been inspired to become not just an advocate, but an activist, and ensuring that we work together to address the issues that have been identified today. So thank you for your work as the Special Rapporteur for people with disabilities at the UN. It's great to meet you. I hope to meet you in person when we come to Ireland.
Sure thing. And
All right.
keep well. Lovely to connect with you. All the best.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And we will have our next session in 2 weeks. In 2 weeks, so join us again. Thank you, everyone. Thank you to our interpreters. Much appreciated. All right. Bye-bye, everybody.
Thank you for watching Embracing the Difference Globally, the Ability event.